Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. Bill Robson, the president of the C.D. Howe Institute, in front of you to say good evening. Thank you for coming. We very much look forward to an enlightening and energetic discussion of big tech, its role in disseminating information, accurate or otherwise, and what the public policy possibilities are for taming it to the extent it needs to be tamed and making sure that we get all the value from it that it offers. My notes from my colleagues, and I always follow my notes from my colleagues, say that in addition to introducing myself, I should mention the C.D. Howe Institute. It is a charity, a public policy think tank. We tackle anything that we think is material to Canada's economy, Canadian living standards, and where we think we have something constructive to offer policymakers. This is an area that has grown in importance enormously, as I don't need to elaborate in front of you now, but I know that we're all interested in what the way forward is. We have the amazing new technologies that have provided huge enhancements to our quality of life, but we're now discovering that they can be put to use in ways that are problematic, and we're looking for ways to get the best that we can out of the situation. We are delighted to have the support of Aaron and Heather Regent for the Regent debates. This has become an absolute top-line event in the C.D. Howe Institute's annual calendar, bringing together people who are knowledgeable, have insights, and can help us think more deeply and constructively about the challenges that we face. Aaron Regent, a board member of the C.D. Howe Institute, has been deeply engaged in the work of the Institute. He's got a real passion for policy as well as a great business head. I know there are many in the room who have worked with him or for him when he was at Brookfield, when he was at Falconbridge, when he was at Barrick. There are board members I know from Scotia and from Nutrien here as well, so you know without my needing to elaborate what an effective voice he is at the board table. What's special in this instance is that he has put his support behind this debate. We're very grateful to him, and Aaron, I'd be very glad to welcome you to the podium to say a few words about the debate.
Well, thank you, Bill, for that very kind introduction, and thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for joining us. But before I begin, I'd like to extend a special note of thanks to the NBA for not scheduling games 5 and 6 tonight. That would have been stiff competition. I think you're up for it, but that would have been tough to face. Anyway, tough loss for Toronto last night, but a championship is near, I believe. And it'd be great and a huge accomplishment, and so great for the City of Toronto and for Canada. So go Raptors. Tonight's resolution touches on perhaps one of the most serious and complex issues facing governments and policymakers around the world. The advances in technology have been so rapid, disruptive, and transformative to so many aspects of our society, and have brought about remarkable and positive change. Big tech has changed the way we communicate, how we work, how we vote, produce, buy, and sell goods, and how we get our information. But there is also a dark side to this progress, which has created other issues around privacy, market power, control of information, national security, and concentration of wealth, amongst others. It has also exposed the vulnerabilities of both democratic and non-democratic societies alike to be manipulated and undermined by outside forces. There's increasing momentum for governments to now intervene and take action, designing a coherent regulatory response to these multidimensional challenges will bend the mind. But intervention may yet be justified in several domains. We need to ask what specific harm we are trying to remedy and how regulators can ensure they do not inadvertently increase compliance costs or suffocate innovation. But should governments intervene? Radical free market economists, cynically skeptical of all government intervention, have always made a powerful argument that competition rather than regulation is the best way to tackle potential monopolies. Over time, any company that abuses its dominance, gouges customers, and fattens margins invites deadly new competitors to reinvent its market. The rate of competitive churn in the technology industry is also striking as innovators invent ever better mousetraps. Such is the pace of change that abusive technology companies rarely last long before they are rendered obsolete. But good outcomes are never certain. They take thoughtful, policy-based on considered debate. And that is what tonight is all about, and why Heather and I are so pleased to sponsor these debates. Above all else, these debates are meant to stimulate discussion on critical issues, and tonight I think we are in for a doozy. What a privilege and honor it is to have such an incredible panel of debaters to lead that discussion, and such an esteemed panel of experts on the jury. Quite frankly, none require an introduction, but that is no reason to deny them, and Bill will be back in a moment to formally introduce the panel. For now, let me just say, Director Comey, Melanie Aitken, David Plouffe, and Robert Atkinson, thank you so much for your presence here tonight. We are so honored to have you all. Let me also say thank you to the C.D. Howe Institute for staging these debates. The best defense against bad public policy is an informed citizenry, and the Institute's work is so important in this regard. Heather and I are proud to be supporters, and I hope everyone here will get involved if you're not involved already. I'd like to specifically thank our moderator, Bill, and Duncan Munn, who has been instrumental in putting tonight's debate together, and the rest of the C.D. Howe staff, with a special shout out to Devin and Paulina. And finally, thank you to all of you for coming and participating in this great national dialogue, and I hope you enjoy your evening.
Well, thank you, Aaron, and nicely captured both the substance that we're going to be debating tonight and also our motivation in doing it. Aaron and Heather, one more time, thank you very much for your support. So ladies and gentlemen, let me go through in somewhat telegraphic form what we're going to be doing. The accomplishments and credentials of our debaters are in front of you. To do full justice to them would eat rather badly into our discussion time. So let me simply, again, fairly telegraphically say that on the affirmative, on government's the need to regulate big tech in the public interest, we have James Comey, among many other accomplishments, Director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation from 2013 to 2017. Also for the affirmative, Melanie Aitken, former competition commissioner in Canada, currently with Bennett Jones, and it's a pleasure, Melanie, to welcome you back to the C.D. Howe Institute venue. On the negative, Rob Atkinson, President, Information Technology and Innovation Foundation. And David Plouffe, among other accomplishments, Senior Advisor to President Barack Obama from 2011 to 2013. So, adopting the reading glasses, I told you I always follow the instructions of my colleagues and the events team that Aaron rightfully complimented just now carefully. Let me just give a sense of where we're going to be going this evening. The first thing that we will do is we will have an initial vote that involves both the all of you in the room. I believe you should all have clickers at your table. Rudyard Griffiths, impresario of the Monk debates, a great inspiration for some of this format, knows how these things work, so he'll help us out should anything go awry. And we also have a jury that will be voting, and the idea is that we vote both before and after we've heard the debaters' arguments, and we'll be interested to see if the group has been persuaded one way or another by what they have heard. We are going to do that in a few minutes, but just to sort of take you through the program ahead of time so that you'll know what's coming, we will then have an opening statement starting with the affirmative side from James Comey. That'll be 5 minutes. An opening statement from Rob Atkinson. That will be 5 minutes. Similarly, 5 minutes from Melanie Aitken, 5 minutes from David Plouffe. Then a series of 2-minute rebuttals with Melanie Aitken going first. I think I have this right, and of course the debaters will correct me as they'll be correcting each other. David Plouffe on the negative rebutting, then Jim Comey on the affirmative, and then Rob Atkinson. At that point, we will break, and the jury will ask some questions. of the debaters, which they will answer as they see fit to divide the topics among themselves. We will get in about an hour's time to our closing remarks by each of the debaters, who will have 4 minutes for their closing remarks. And at that point, we will have another vote to see how you as a whole and how the jury may feel, and whether they feel any differently about the proposition in front of us after having heard the arguments. So that's in fairly telegraphic outline how we are going to be proceeding. What I would now like to do is invite you all to find the clickers on your table if you have not already. And what we are going to do is we are going to vote. The votes of the jury and the audience will be counted separately. The clickers should be on and ready to use. If you change your mind, I believe that it's possible to hit the button a second time, or hit a second button, and the clicker will record the last response that you submit. So that will proceed in just a few minutes. I'll also mention, just for the sake of getting everybody squared, that we have a countdown clock in front of the debaters, and I think that the microphones may fail to work once you've run out of time. We'll see whether we have that help from technology, but counting on the debaters to observe the time. So I believe it is time for the initial vote. I can't see you because the lighting is very bright, but I can sort of sense that the clickers are in people's hands. And so while you are voting, and we are compiling the results, and they will be displayed on the screen once the compilation is done, let me just take a moment to introduce the jury members while this is going on. The first thing that I'll do is mention again, Aaron was good enough to single out for praise my colleague, Senior Vice President and Chief Operating Officer of the CD Howe Institute, Duncan Munn, who was absolutely instrumental in driving this forward. So he's not a member of the jury, but he's there in spirit. The chair of the jury is Hugh McKinnon, who is also the chair of the CD Howe Institute's Board of Directors and the CEO of Bennett Jones. Not pulling rank in any way, we also have Aaron Regent on the jury. Naturally, he is the CEO. I don't think I even mentioned this in the introduction of Magris Resources. That's his current venture, and also, of course, the moving force behind this debate. We have Gianluca Cairo, Chief of Staff to the Minister of Innovation, Science and Economic Development, Government of Canada. We have Paul Fletcher, Partner, Deloitte Canada. We have Mark Machin, President of the CPP Investment Board. Tiff Macklem, Dean of the Rotman School of Management. Christine McGee, co-founder, Sleep Country Canada. John Manley, former Deputy Prime Minister of Canada. Kevin Piesker, President, Microsoft Canada. And Michael Wilson, Chief of Staff to the Attorney General of Ontario. Thank you, jury members. Now, like all of you, I'm agog to learn the results of the opening vote.
Look at you.
Well, the jury is feeling a little bit more libertarian than the audience. And also perhaps a little more open-minded, but we clearly have a sense that things are perhaps a bit out of control, that something is needed. So, of course, that provides a little bit of material for the affirmative side to work with. And because in Canada we always cheer for the underdog, unless Golden State is now the underdog, we'll be sort of seeing whether the negative side can make any headway here. So, as prefigured, we now move to opening statements by James Comey, and we look forward to that very much. Jim, over to you. Okay, thank you.
Let me begin by thanking the Institute and Aaron Regent for this opportunity and a chance to participate in a conversation about a really important topic that we're obviously going to win. Governments should regulate big technology in the public interest. Big technology promised to change our world, and they delivered on that promise in extraordinary ways. But in exchange for amazing convenience, undreamed of connection, we, the citizens and consumers, have surrendered something to the big technology platforms and providers, mostly without knowing it or noticing it. But governments have to notice, and because they notice, they must act. There are two reasons why I believe that governments must regulate big tech in the public interest. The first is that technology companies now have power that actually strains the frameworks through which we govern the restrictions that are appropriate on government power. In many ways, big technology, with their collection of information about us, big tech companies have become as powerful or more powerful in some ways than government. When I was a government investigator, I used to dream of having the ability to collect information that Google had, that Facebook had, what they could know about the people that we are investigating that we couldn't possibly know. We spend a lot of time trying to figure out, especially in Canada and the United States, how to make sure we have a government of limited powers, that we rope down the Leviathan, that we have due process, that we have oversight, that we have accountability, because government has enormous power. But the government can know what we made in income last year. The government can know how much we gave to charity. The government, in many places, can know the health challenges that we face. But the government can't know that we are struggling with our sexuality, that we are considering a divorce, that we are depressed, that we are considering getting pregnant. The government can't know as much about our future as technology can. They can't know as much about our present as technology can. The big tech platforms can know today the essence of personhood, which is our future, our dreams, our sense of ourselves in a way that even those closest to us can't. That strains the frameworks that we apply normally and requires that we focus upon the power that we have unintentionally transferred to these entities. Now, don't buy the business that you're going to hear about if we regulate them, we might kill the goose that laid the golden egg of innovation. We regulate finance companies in Canada and the United States. We regulate insurance companies. And we do that in both places because those enterprises have tremendous information about us and the power to do harm. So we regulate them. And last time I checked, both finance and insurance are doing fine, now that the people of our governments have asserted themselves to rope those leviathans down a bit. Technology has become more powerful than government in many ways, and so we have to think about it in the way we think about restricting government power. Second, technology creates safe spaces for bad people. They recruit there, they threaten there, they harm there, in ways that really are no different than the harm somebody might commit in a public square. We regulate that public square, we make sure that bad things can't happen there, we must insist that the public squares that are the Facebooks of the world, that are the Googles of the world, are required to police their public spaces. Now that doesn't mean the government should monitor and prescribe content. In our two countries, that would be a dicey proposition given the rights that our people have retained to themselves and the limits on government. But there are things that can be done. In the States, a landlord whose property is used for drug trafficking and knows about it, even if he's not involved in the drug trafficking, is criminally liable for the behavior in his property because we've judged he best knows how to monitor that space. The same kind of restrictions should be considered for the tech spaces, who know that on their platforms are terrorists, are pedophiles, are bad people of all sorts seeking to harm. And the second way in which they provide safe space is through the ubiquitous use of strong encryption, which is a wonderful thing and a terrible thing, because it makes it impossible for our judges to give meaning to due process, to allow us to investigate that pedophile by getting the content of his communications. Increasingly, big tech has decided that's off limits to us and changed the way we govern ourselves. Tech ought not to decide how we govern ourselves. We ought to decide how we govern ourselves. Governments must act to regulate tech in the public interest. Thank you.
Important ideas cogently delivered, and at the risk of sounding like an impresario, exactly to time. Thank you very much. Rob, over to you.
Okay, well, thank you so much. I want to thank Regent and the T.D. Howe Institute, which we have great admiration for. Also, it's really nice to be here, back in Toronto. I grew up near Bloor and Islington, and I'm a Raptors fan, so I was disappointed last night. I still have my fingers crossed. And also want to thank Melanie and Director Comey. So this is a hard debate to win. I was at the airport today and going through customs, and the agent said, "What are you here for?" I said, "Business." He said, "What kind of business?" I said, "A debate." "What's the debate on?" I said, "Should we regulate big tech?" And he said, at the end he goes, "Yes." I said, "Yes, what?" And he said, "We should regulate big tech." So we have the hard job here, but let me be legalistic. The debate says, should governments regulate big tech to protect the public interest? That suggests you shouldn't regulate small tech, or you shouldn't regulate anybody else. So let's look at some of the cases that we talk about. Director Comey talked about privacy. So if you really want to look at some of the privacy issues, the biggest ones are not in tech companies. It's in insurance companies and banks and credit reporting bureaus. So absolutely, in the United States, we need a stronger national privacy regime. But the idea that we would apply that privacy regime only to Google and Facebook and maybe Microsoft and a few other big companies and not apply it to everybody else who's also using data makes absolutely no sense. And yet that's what the title of the debate is. Should we regulate big tech? And I read that to say only big tech. Another case is algorithmic bias. We're moving more and more into a world of AI, and there's a risk of AI being used in a biased way, whether it's gender or race or other issues. Now, I don't have a lot of worries about that because I think tech companies and others are figuring that out. But are we going to say we should only regulate bias when it comes to tech companies? And if you're an insurance company or if you're Toronto TD Bank here in Canada, you can use algorithms for bias? No, of course not. So that's point number one. Point number two, the real question here is really not about regulation. It's about how we do regulation and the risk of over-regulating. And the case in point, the poster child of tech over-regulation is Europe. And if you look at the GDPR, what's called the General Data Privacy Protection Regulation, you see very significant impacts. In the last 12 months since the GDPR has gone into effect, you've seen a decline of venture funding and venture-funded startups and venture capital committed by over 30%. You've seen compliance costs by companies in Europe go skyrocketing. In fact, the GDPR is estimated by one academic study in Europe to create over 100,000 jobs. Compliance jobs. Now, is that the way we want to grow our economy? I don't think so. The second point here is, Director Comey said that they know everything about you. That's not really true. A computer might know something about me. So when I use my Gmail, a computer algorithmically matches an ad to something in my text. There's not a single person at Google or Facebook or any of these other companies. There aren't people reading that and going, I think Rob should get a bicycle ad because he rides his bike to work. It's a computer algorithm. And these companies have very strong incentives to not divulge that data to advertisers. And again, if we are concerned about privacy, which I think we should be, the answer is a national privacy regime that applies to all. I think one of the big challenges here is we've all become complacent. It is the goose that laid the golden egg. And I wanted to keep laying more golden eggs. And yet, when we think about it, who would have thought 10, 20 years ago that I would have in my pocket a supercomputer? Who would have thought 15 years ago that I could go on a website and choose from 480 million different products and have that to my door the next day? And that's what Amazon does. So these technology companies have given us an enormous array of goods and services and benefits. And I think one of the challenges is it's really hard to see the risks of this. It's easy to think, oh yeah, sure, we can regulate and everything will be fine. But what we don't know and we don't see are some of the risks to that. We're in a phase right now, what I would argue is the next big phase of innovation through connectivity, of Internet of Things, 5G, autonomous systems, and artificial intelligence. To build that system out in North America is going to take trillions and trillions of dollars for us to get there. And if you look at who's making those investments, it's not small companies, it's not big traditional companies, it's big tech companies. The top 5 big tech companies account for 7 times more R&D funding than the National Science Foundation. So in closing, I would just read a quote. I hope I have 7 seconds. The London Times, 1872, railed against big telegraph, and they said, "The mischief that is done by big telegraph cannot be overstated."
Wow. Well, Rob, we might not have heard the quote, but we heard you loud and clear. Thank you for that, and also for some crispness in terms of the definition for the resolution. Very helpful. Melanie, we're in your hands.
So thank you very much, and let me begin by thanking the Institute for the opportunity to be here. I am not by disposition quite as confident as Director Comey, but I do hope that we persuade you about this important question at this critical time. I actually think that Rob's custom agent got it right. The cost of free is far too steep. Without government intervention, the steady march of the incumbent digital platforms to dominate, to manipulate, and to exploit our every activity in every conceivable corner of our personal and public lives is inevitable. There's no denying that technological innovation has spurred enormous developments in tech, and it's been of enormous value to society. And it bears unlimited potential for ever greater innovation, advancements in the future. But only if we confront the uncomfortable truths about the exploding risks to our economic well-being, our liberty, our very democracy, and our personal and national security. We have to learn from the past. We have to be courageous. We must accept the unassailable fact that markets distorted will not self-correct. Sure, we can identify current enforcement tools and standards like the antitrust merger control or the abusive dominance standards, but one can't really debate that whether it's owing to a reluctance philosophically to enforce or simply that they don't have the right tools, we have not seen much impediment put in the way of the steady march. Do not be comforted by a "we got this" refrain from the international antitrust agencies. They're understandably jealous to protect their domain and respectfully naive about the consequences of having ignored this too long, of having not at a minimum sought greater resources and/or sought to try to understand new measures of those all-important non-price effects. Those are very central to what has both attracted consumers like moths to a flame and impeding the ability for any meaningful antitrust enforcement. It's a subject all its own, but at the heart of the inability of the antitrust agencies to prevent and redress the harms is the challenge that it feels like consumers are benefiting from free access to this open market. What could be better? But this is an illusion. Remember always the phrase, if something feels too good, it probably is. The price is real and yet unimaginable as yet in its scope, and the cost to innovation, not to mention privacy and national security, is enormous. Even if more resources and a more sophisticated approach to the economic analysis were available to us, I say this not lightly, as a free markets advocate, but there are significant elements of utility to these platforms and how they operate, and they must yield to the overriding public interest. We have grappled with innovative disruption before and moved to forestall enduring market distortion, but so far in this case, all we've done is sit on the sidelines and wring our hands. Well, it seems that these wonders are at our fingertips and they're for free. The truth is anything but, and we are only just becoming vaguely aware of the costs of this unholy bargain where we forfeit our privacy and our liberty in exchange for access to digital services. So let's look for a moment at how it is that the online platforms have enjoyed this explosive growth and sketch the inevitability of the harm if they're left unchecked. And you judge for yourself whether you think that the public outcry and alarm and the crossing of all ideological lines calling for action are really an overreaction. Digital platforms have a natural tendency to lead to monopoly power, and the reasons are exceedingly complex, but in a sense very simple. The network effects, the more people that are on the platform, the more powerful it becomes, the more must-have it becomes, and the smarter the algorithm becomes. The strong economies of scale and scope, owing to the low marginal cost of expansion and the corresponding incentive to do anything you need to do to eliminate pretenders, means that nobody is going to take you on. The non-transparency of the activity, while the platform owner knows everything about everything that goes on its platform, including all transactions by its competitors, and you've got this vast and ever-expanding reach into areas previously thought impossible. And once established, the durability of that market power is robust. Without intervention, the enormous profit incentive which we rely on in effective and working markets just isn't even close enough to take it on. The barriers are simply too high. The platform controls the gateway, it names the rules of the game, it can prefer its own goods by messaging, by placement, it can squash competitors like bugs. It can exploit the massive consumer and business data it collects, and in the case of consumers, it is a deal done in the dark. Personal information is bargained away with only a fleeting, if any, opportunity to opt out or even begin to appreciate what that information is going to be used for. Now the plot, oh boy, okay, well, I'm going to have to wrap that up.
Before time ran up, you gave us some cogent economic insights and also a lot of motivation for why they matter. So, Melanie, thank you. David, over to you now. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I want to thank you, C.D. Howe, for having me and sponsoring this important debate. I live in San Francisco now, surrounded by rabid Warriors fans. Yet I am ferociously rooting for the Raptors. So I do not expect that to influence your final vote, but I thought I'd mention it at the beginning of the evening. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time actually talking about regulation more broadly, in addition to tech specifically. I have an interesting background. I've sat in the government chair. I've also sat in the other chair talking to people in government about regulation. And I'm a political progressive, so I believe in government activism and I believe in government regulation. I think political progressives, though, should have a very high bar. If we believe in that, then we should be the first ones to call out regulation when it's premature. I believe that no regulation is better than wrong regulation, or dumb regulation, or premature regulation, or regulation that looks backwards instead of forward. When I worked in the White House in Washington, President Obama actually, in 2011, it's shocking that this hadn't happened in decades, asked for the first formal review of all regulations on the books. And what came out of that process was scary and frightening, whether you were on the right, left, center. Many regulations that had not been looked at for decades. And these are in slow-moving industries, not the tech industry. My favorite one was we had two different agencies regulating pizza, one for cheese pizza and one for pepperoni pizza. And so the lesson there, I think, is we have to be very, very careful. History suggests, whether you're in Canada, Europe, Australia, South America, United States, it is hard enough to pass a smart law for the times or promulgate a smart regulation for the times. It is next to impossible to claw back regulation, to change laws. And so we really better be careful here, first and foremost, to do no harm. I spent a few years traveling the globe when I worked at Uber. Spent a lot of time in all parts of the world, here in this city and throughout Canada. And what was fascinating about that discussion, almost every room I went into, whether it was an elected official or regulator, they thought about ride sharing, generally Uber specifically, through the prism of taxis and taxi regulation. That was the question. Well, we have these things called taxis, and we have regulations for them. In some cases, they've been around for a generation. In some cases, for a century. And so if you can fit your service into this, you can operate. And I think we have to understand that the people who are doing the regulating here are super important. So I'm sure it's better in Ottawa, but for those of you that have watched tech executives go to Washington, D.C. and testify in front of our members of Congress, it's a frightening spectacle. You would not trust most those members of Congress to reset your home Wi-Fi router, much less regulate algorithms and artificial intelligence. And so as we think about this, I think it is important, the lesson. So you look at the poll earlier, I'm surprised it was only 71%. I think we all, Robert and I, agree that there's going to be some regulation. But what I hope you can think about is to get to the point where it's no unless, or yes, not until. We have to be very, I think, concerned about, I think Robert made a really important point. This isn't just about regulating big tech. Data is coursing through all of our businesses and all of our economy. Same thing with privacy, same thing with elections. And so if we're going to, right now, politicians too often are forced to react to headlines. And I think social media is a place that this has been accelerated. There's a great example of this yesterday. You might have seen there was a tragic helicopter accident in New York City. A pilot of a helicopter from a tour company crashed. Well, so tragedy, there was one fatality, and the council chairman in New York came out today and said Uber is planning next month to start Ubercopter from downtown Manhattan to the Hamptons, and said we better think about pausing that. There can be an overreaction, and politicians and regulators both. It was hard enough 10 or 15 years ago when you had microphones from the press in front of you. Now you're surrounded by a cacophony of voices every day saying, you must do something, and you must do it now. But if we get this wrong, and I'm sure there are going to be some regulations, but if we get this wrong, what's going to happen is we're going to stifle innovation, we're going to hurt our economy, but it's already more likely than not that this is going to be the Chinese century. If they are able to dominate technology investments, artificial intelligence, algorithm advances, it is definitely going to be the Chinese century. We've accelerated that. So I'd much rather have these advances happening in North America.
Thank you very much. Some important cautionary notes and well illustrated, so thank you, David, for that. We proceed at breakneck pace to the rebuttals. If I have the order right, Melanie, you'll be up first, and over to you. Thank you.
Okay, I'll try to respect the clock this time better. Listen, market power is not a dirty word. We absolutely celebrate the innovative energy that builds the better mousetrap, that launches the better Uber service. But the difficulty is that market power, once acquired, grows rapidly and is durable. And the challenge is to identify when it is abusing that power, when it is moving relentlessly in the direction of extinguishing competition and competitors. And we see in the digital platforms that we have tripped that wire. There is gateway power, the power to exclude, to set the terms of play. There is leverage power, where we see the dominant platforms systematically excluding, weakening, and denying access to their competitors. And we see the exercise of exploitative power. We see the all-knowing platform owner using its asymmetrical information in order to identify, target, and eliminate its competition. We do need to respond, and we do not need to abandon the incentive to profit, to encourage innovation, to urge people to make that new invention, to launch that new business. What we need to do, though, is to harness that power and to protect innovation. Because if we eliminate it through allowing these platforms to dominate, we will, make no mistake, eliminate innovation. If we had innovation today, we would see different options in terms of protections for privacy. We don't. We see a unified assault on that principle. And so what we need to do, and I fully agree with my counterpart, that we need to be careful and surgical in creating these laws. We only intervene as a last resort, but it is essential. We have hit that tipping point, that inflection point is here.
I know we've been talking about the sports analogies. This feels like end-to-end action to me. David, please.
Obviously, we can all find data to support our views on market power, but I think there's a few recent developments that are interesting. First of all, generically, you're most concerned about market power that turns into price gouging and really reducing consumer choice. And if anything, you see a lot of the tech-based services, whether it's Amazon, ride-sharing, consistently trying to keep prices down. So that makes it more available and democratizes things like transportation and food delivery, and I think that's really important. I think a lot of these services have brought more, it's not just to urban areas like Toronto or San Francisco, rural areas, poor urban areas have really been served well by this. But if you look at just today, Amazon announced that they were closing up their restaurant delivery service because other players have emerged that are succeeding with more force and with more confidence. Netflix is obviously under great competitive pressure now from Disney and others. You see a lot of pressure even in social media, where particularly people under 25 are more and more often choosing not to sign up for Facebook. And I do think what's happened in Europe around the GDPR, and I agree with a lot of the principles of the GDPR. Robert mentioned what's happening to some of the venture investing, but you're also seeing a lot of smaller tech companies close up shop. Because at the end of the day, when you are laying on huge compliance requirements, massive consumer outreach, when you do things like opt-in, you are putting a huge onus on smaller firms that are less resourced. And obviously the more established firms, the more well-resourced firms are going to be able to engage in a form of regulatory arbitrage and be benefited from that. So again, I think the idea of we need to regulate big tech because they have too much market power sounds good, but I think when you dig in a little bit, there's a different story. And all tech companies are not the same. Amazon's different than Facebook, Facebook's different than Uber, Uber's different than Airbnb.
Regulation favoring the incumbents. It has been known to happen. Thank you. Jim.
Thank you. It appears we agree up here on two things. The first is that government should regulate big tech in the public interest. And the second is that government should do it carefully. We agree very much about that. I want to comment on a couple of things that our opponents said, which I think are reasonable, but I want to put them into context. First, yes, we should be very careful about, especially the United States Congress, regulating anything. I've spent a lot of time in front of that august body, and one of my aides used to say it was like visiting the bar scene in Star Wars. We're off the record, right? We're off the record, okay, good. And if we only had these shut-off mics in Congress, that would be awesome. But what Melanie and I are suggesting is not that our legislators regulate, but that our legislators reflect the public interest by identifying those areas that experts ought to promulgate regulation in. We struggled as our two nations with the great technological development of the 20th century, the telephone, and what to do about the tremendous concentration of power in the hands of a few monopolies, duopolies that dominated. And we found a way with expert guidance, intervention by the courts, to whack that up, which actually opened the way for the developments we're seeing now, for the goose to lay more golden eggs. So we're not asking, please don't hear us to suggest that legislators regulate, but that legislators identify the public interest and ask the experts to regulate. The challenge of applying, Melanie will fix this, but while I have 30 seconds, of applying traditional antitrust thinking about price effects is that we're talking about free services here. So price effects should not drive the analysis or lead us to believe we shouldn't apply antitrust principles to this situation, because even though people are getting a free good, there is tremendous limitation of competition. Facebook eats everybody.
That was a great use of your final 2 seconds. Facebook eats everybody. Rob.
All right, well, thank you. Well, first of all, Director Comey, we don't all agree. I don't agree we should regulate big tech. I think we should regulate issues in the new digital emerging economy. It's very different than taking one small segment of it and targeting that for regulatory action. Second, I want to make a point here. Neither David or I are libertarians. David was in the Obama administration, and I'm Canadian. So this isn't some libertarian fantasy we're spinning. This is grounded in analysis and how we can figure out a way to get progress for Americans and Canadians going forward. I want to address the antitrust issue that Melanie brought up, where she said these companies are using it to squash competition. First of all, regulatory antitrust authorities in both Canada and the US have plenty of tools right now for any time any company, tech or non-tech, big or small, uses their power in an anti-competitive way. They can bring action, and they should bring action. We don't need to revamp antitrust rules. We don't need new regulations. We just need antitrust authorities to be doing their job. And if any of these companies behave in an anti-competitive way, great, go after them. To date, there hasn't been very much evidence of that, if any. Secondly, Melanie talked about squashing competitors. We have to recognize, what are we trying to do here? What I think we're trying to do here is not protect every business from competition. If you're in business, you take a risk. You might go out of business because a better competitor has a better mousetrap. And if you succeed, you make a lot of money. We don't take the upside. We shouldn't protect you from the downside. So yes, a lot of these technology companies are disruptive in the Schumpeterian way of positive creative destruction, and that helps everybody. Last point, the Canadian government is making a big bet on the technology of the future, including superclusters. And if the Canadian government goes down this path, to David's point, this sends a very clear message that you're not friendly to tech.
Not friendly to tech. That was very information-rich and delivered with great force and authority, so we're already deeply in debt to our debaters, but we're going to go a little bit deeper in debt. It is now time for the jury questions. With these lights, I'm having trouble picking Hugh McKinnon out, but I think I know where. Yep, very good. Hugh, please do come to the front. And I'm now going to step back from this lectern, and Hugh, our jury chair, is going to pose some questions to the debaters, who will have each 2 minutes to respond. And I think, Jim and Melanie, I think you're up first. Hugh.
Thank you, Bill. It does look like Jurassic Park out there. Since no network can ever be secure from a determined foreign enemy, hostile governments are interfering in elections and with critical infrastructure. And now AI deepfakes can flawlessly make a person appear to say anything they like on social media, which can obviously lead to chaos. Is it not true that the digital platforms can represent a national security risk so significant that government intervention is required?
Let me take this one. Yeah. I'll take this one. Thank you for that. Should I wait for that? There we go. I know how tough they are in time. I don't want to cede any of my time. The answer is we should be deeply concerned about the repositories of information about our very persons that reside within the server farms of big technology. But I hope I don't surprise you by saying something I think my opponents will agree with. I actually don't think government intervention in that security space would be fruitful or effective, because governments themselves have a heck of a time trying to secure their own data, and actually don't think they're significantly better at it than the tech companies. What we ought to make sure happens is that we understand as a country what data is being stored on those server farms. My opponent, Rob, said that we should feel a little bit better because it's not a person who knows of my interest in cycling, it's a computer. That actually cuts the other way for me and makes me worry very much about just what is stored, and if there's not human oversight of it and the guards and gates around it, how on earth can that information be secure from, in particular, the Chinese, who are hungry for large data sets as they try and build their own predictive machines, less for commercial purposes and more to control their own people. But somehow we have to make sure that human beings are accountable for protecting that information. I don't think that responsibility should fall to the government for practical reasons. And I'll stop there.
Thank you. That exhausts the time. In that case, Melanie, are you?
I thought it went, I'm good.
Yes, your side is next. Hugh, next question. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm getting this wrong. Yes, your turn to answer. I told you I follow my colleagues' notes assiduously. I should listen to what I say. David.
Well, there may be no one in the world better suited to speak to this issue than Director Comey, and I appreciate those comments. I do think what's interesting is the tech companies actually are crying out, maybe not for regulation, but government leadership and coordination here, and I hope certainly in our country with a very important election coming up that happens. Similar to some of my comments about you have to be very focused on who's doing the regulating. I think particularly around elections in America, I have some skepticism simply because we have a hard time running our elections on the ground. We can't do the simple data analysis, it appears, at the local level to figure out how many voting machines we need based on turnout patterns, how many poll workers we need. We have one of our political parties in America seems to be more passionate about denying people the right to vote if they can than making it easier to vote. So I think we have to be careful about this. The other thing in America is obviously we have an incumbent president whose re-election campaign will probably welcome interference from Moscow and Pyongyang and Tehran and other countries. So it's complicated. But I do think that who we elect and how we elect them is one of the most sacred things in any democracy. And we obviously had, it wasn't a warhead pointed at us, but we had a foreign adversary and a foreign leader use modern techniques to sow political terrorism and unrest in our country. And so I think this is a place where the government and the tech companies need to work together to make sure that we have early warning systems. And not just in terms of deep fakes and fake news and the content farms in Eastern Europe that we saw in 16 and 18 will again in 20, but we've obviously had reports of really serious efforts to try and actually hack into voting machines. So I think we're in agreement on this, but I think this is one where, quite frankly, the government, it may not be regulation as we traditionally think about it, but we need to see more leadership. But I think it's super complicated south of the border, maybe a little less so here.
Thank you very much.
Jury question number 2. Is it possible to regulate the tech giants as publishers, focusing narrowly on content without governments prescribing what they should and should not be allowed to carry and display? To the extent that regulation restricts people's right to free speech and freedom to read and listen what they would like, do we risk losing something more important?
Thank you. This time we go to Rob and David first, I believe.
All right, well, thank you. So who gets to decide that? Should we, so if I'm a Facebook or I'm a tech platform, whose standards should I use? Should I use Thailand's? Because in Thailand, if you put a video of the king turning into a monkey, you can go to jail on YouTube. So should YouTube use that standard here in Canada? Of course not. So whose standards do they apply? And who gets to decide those standards? What happens here in Canada if a particular party, liberal or conservative, one party decides they want to impose a particular standard that is heavier regulation on conservative speech? Is that going to be okay? And then if another party gets in and they say we want to go the other way? Fundamentally, you can't have government dictating speech. Now, I think these are really tough questions, and they're perhaps the most important questions we're facing today. But what's important to understand is companies have very, very strong incentives to get this right. Number one, they're damned if they do and they're damned if they don't. If they take down too much speech, they're attacked for being one side or the other. If they don't take down enough, they're attacked as enabling hate speech or the like. So they are walking a very, very fine line. The other component about this is, if you think about how many videos are posted in YouTube, or how many tweets are posted every second, or how many posts on Facebook, it is in the billions. There's no way that you can do that manually. And so one of the big things that big companies are able to do is use AI and other advanced technologies in very, very important ways. And small companies just can't do that. And so one of the things that's happened in the last 4 or 5 years is big companies have applied AI to really be much, much more effective at taking down this content that's not appropriate. And lastly, when you heard Mark Zuckerberg recently talk about the idea, he wants help. How should he make these decisions? These can't be government decisions. They can't be private-owned decisions. This has to be a collective action problem that society comes together and comes up with the guidelines for each country, and then the companies won't comply.
Thank you, Rob. We now go to the affirmative side for their take on this question. Melanie.
Okay, well, listen, I don't deny there is some tough line drawing to be had, but is that a reason to take the risks of standing by and doing nothing? In Canada, certainly, we have accepted that there are times when it comes to pornography, to true hate speech, to inspiring violence, there are times we will step in and we accept that the public interest demands that we do so. I would offer some caution in taking Mark Zuckerberg's words at face value, and I don't say so pejoratively, but rather he sees that train coming barreling right at him. He recognizes something is going to happen. We have an unusual crossing of all ideological lines, aligning in favor of some kind of regulation. So he sees it coming and very wisely seeks to be part of the process, seeks to manage that process, and seeks to position himself in such a way that when regulation inevitably does come upon him, he will be in the best position to manage his regulator and to embed himself with that regulator. And that may sound cynical, that is perfectly rational, perfectly lawful, economically sound and rational behavior. But it is the fact, it is the truth, and it is what we need to confront. If we are prepared simply to shut our eyes and to sit back and to let every bit of privacy we have be trampled upon, allow every opportunity for violence to be expanded and run amok because they found a platform on which they can spread their views, then that is a world I personally don't want to live in, and I don't believe that you would either.
Melanie, thank you. We have had 2 questions from the jury. We now have 2 more. Hugh, back to you.
Well, as we've heard tonight, big data and algorithms can yield tremendous insights. However, we now understand that algorithms can reinforce bias at scale and risk creating social echo chambers. There's also the potential danger that the combination of algorithms and deep data at the micro-personal level can enable platforms to unduly influence and even manipulate users, which some have called surveillance capitalism. Don't governments have a responsibility to step in and protect the public interest in the face of these concerns?
Yeah.
Thank you. Well, the affirmative side has addressed a few of those points, so building from your base.
Okay, thank you. Absolutely. As we said in the remarks you've heard from the 2 of us so far, this is one of the core concerns we have, where we think, at least so far, governments have abandoned their obligation to protect the public interest. Surveillance capitalism is the term, I think, coined by an academic at Harvard to capture the idea that what's going on here is that the big platforms like Facebook and Google are collecting data that not only monitors what we do today, but through the application of sophisticated algorithms is able to predict what we will do tomorrow, so that they can sell that knowledge to people who want to touch us today and tomorrow, and then something even scarier, use that knowledge to shape us, so that if their huge data sets predict that Melanie and I are likely to go in this right fork when we come to the divide, but we might consider the left fork, to find ways to nudge us through their intervention on our social media screens, to nudge us to the one on the left, so we'll buy that thing, travel to that thing, want that thing, maybe more than we would have without their intervention. This is human engineering in the most fundamental way. And if private enterprise is going to engage in this kind of manipulation of the human experience, there is powerful public interest implicated. Now, I want to pick up and agree with something that David said. This allows adversaries of our nations to intervene and to interfere and to shape us, human engineer us, to affect our democracies. The Russians did it and it overachieved in 2016, and they will be back in the United States next year. The central challenge we face in the States is that our commander-in-chief doesn't acknowledge that there even was an attack. And so how does a government prepare to meet this kind of sophisticated threat without that commander's intent from the top? We are in a deep, dark hole in that respect in the United States. You're lucky it's not your problem, although the mass migration that will follow his re-election to Canada will be your problem. David and I have spots picked out.
Gentlemen.
All right, so thank you. So the question is about big data and yielding insights. Let me read you a quote. Large-scale efforts are being made, often with impressive success, to channel our unthinking habits, our purchasing decisions, and our thought processes. Something new, in fact, appears to be entering the pattern of American life with the growing power of our persuaders. That was written in 1957 by Vance Packard. There was a similar techno-panic back then. Remember that subliminal ads on movie theaters were buy Coke? That was all much ado about nothing. We live in a world where there's advertising. We figure that out. Most people aren't persuaded to go do something completely stupid because of it. We figured it out, and that's exactly what's going on today with these issues around AI and data. Secondly, if we're going to regulate AI, we shouldn't be regulating AI itself. We should be regulating its use. We don't regulate computers. We regulate banks that use computers. And so AI is going to be used by companies. So Google is developing algorithms, Microsoft is developing algorithms, IBM is developing algorithms, but it's the companies that are using the algorithms where potential bias or harms could take place. So if you regulate the tools and say you can't use this, somehow this tool cannot be a biased tool, you're missing the point. It's like saying you can't use a hammer to hit somebody over the head. It's not the hammer, it's the hitting them on the head. So the key is we already have laws, at least in the United States, around areas like bias in housing, credit reporting, and employment, and healthcare. And we should be enforcing those laws and extending them to other areas so that algorithms can't be used for bias. But again, this really goes to the core of the debate. This is not an issue about big tech. This is an issue about how we're going to live in a data-driven economy and how we want rules to be able so that we can live effectively there. So last point on this, surveillance capitalism is not a real term. It's used to sell books. It's an extremist term. There's no surveillance going on. Our liberty is not at risk.
Thank you. New facts and arguments continue to come forth. Hugh, one more question from the jury.
Jury question number 4. Given that free pricing offered to users effectively negates most traditional antitrust tests, is effective market dominance over significant data and the ability to bottleneck data flows a sufficient cause for regulation? And if so, can such regulation effectively enhance competition without unfairly harming the incumbents?
There is a point of inflection where the wonders of that golden egg hatching process tip to harm, to endurable harm. And we can recognize that by the rise of exclusionary conduct by the dominant player who's unable to resist the opportunity to dominate and expand its reach and to profit wherever that market power can be exercised at the expense of competition. Look at Amazon. We see it leveraging its power to control access to its platform through its asymmetrical information, advantaging, disciplining, eliminating, systematically weakening competition, and through misinformation and obfuscation to trick consumers into forfeiting their privacy. The pillaging of a diapers.com, to use one of the more commonly known examples, appears on the surface to drive prices down, but it is a static and a short-term measure, ignoring the steady elimination of choice and competitive discipline. We had no fewer than 270 acquisitions of competitive threats by Google, 92 such acquisitions by Facebook since 2007 alone, not one of which was challenged. These are not signs of a healthy market, but rather a devastating and relentless elimination of competition. We can't depend upon the regulatory authorities to control this. They don't got this. We need to be clear about the harms that we're trying to address, and we need to be careful in our crafting of the response. The acquisition, though, make no mistake, by Facebook of Instagram and WhatsApp, everybody criticizes that those were not challenged. They could not have successfully been challenged, I will go out on a limb and say, with the market share they enjoyed at the time, under current antitrust frameworks. And so while my friends have great confidence in the antitrust authorities, and I certainly do too, and I'm a great fan of the work that they do, there are limits to what they can do, and they have very limited resources. To suggest that they've got the answer to all these problems is a dream. Our dominance standards don't stand up either. Yes, we have great fines in Europe for Google, but has that intimidated them one whit? I don't think so.
And on the negative side, we have some cogent arguments.
Well, I'd start, and I think, unfortunately, in a lot of examples, we don't start with this, which is let's start with consumer demand and behavior and wants. And so if you look at whether it's pressing a button on a phone and getting an Uber pool for $3, democratizing transportation, being able to access the suite of Google productivity services that used to cost $100 and $150, making that available. Obviously, democratizing shopping through Amazon and other sites. I think we have to understand that people are not dumb. They've stated pretty clearly that they're desirous of these services. I think across the board you're seeing consistently, whether it's in transportation, whether it's shopping, whether it's in digital entertainment services, the drive is not to monopolize or utilize their market position to jack up prices. It's the very opposite. It's to keep prices down. Of course, that helps those companies grow, but I also think there's societal benefit so that these are not simply services that are available to the coastal elites in America and urban elites throughout the world. The most important statistic in America today, in my view, is that half of our citizens cannot afford a $400 bill they're not anticipating. They're living on the absolute margins. So I think sometimes we can be in places in Ottawa, in Washington, in New York, and San Francisco, and almost talk about these things in an anthropological way. But we have to understand that consumers, human beings, our fellow citizens, are benefiting from these services in a way that enhances their lives, their productivity, their enjoyment of life in a way that they're able to absorb economically. And again, I think if you look across the board, whether it's Netflix, Amazon, even in search, Google is obviously now being greatly pressured by Amazon, but their search numbers are falling. You're seeing a lot more, I think, particularly with young people, choosing other social networking sites. So I think we should be careful here. A lot of this tends to work itself out.
Thank you, Hugh, for those questions. I think I speak for everyone when I say that we're getting new insights as the flow of the conversation continues. And so we're looking forward to the closing remarks. Just to recap, there will be 4 minutes each. The order I have people proceeding in, it has Rob first with his 4 minutes, Melanie with hers, David with his, Jim, you'll be last with your 4-minute closing remarks. And with that, Rob, if you're ready, please proceed.
Well, thank you. It's really been a pleasure and an honor to be here with you tonight. And I want to come back to the key point here. Should we regulate big tech? I read that as, should we regulate big tech and not anybody else? So that really is what you're voting on tonight. And the answer is absolutely not. Again, if you think privacy is an issue, why should a small firm get to violate your privacy? In the US, for example, because we exempt small firms from so much, it's legal in the United States for a small firm to discriminate on the basis of religion, gender, and age. Why? If we think those are important, every firm, not just big firms, should comply with those regulations. I want to talk a little bit about the issue of competition that Melanie has raised. And she brings up the iconic case that everybody brings up, which is WhatsApp. The antitrust authorities were asleep. How could they possibly allow this merger? You have to remember two things. Number one, the very first thing that antitrust authorities do whenever a case comes before them around monopoly or mergers is this question of defining the relevant market. The relevant market is not social media or communications. The relevant market in these industries is simple. It's ads. It's the advertising market. That's the market these companies are in. And if Google and Facebook and these other companies have dominance in the ad market, in other words, so when Procter & Gamble wants to put a digital ad on, they're going to have to pay an extravagant amount for that digital ad, that's a problem. But right now, those two companies have only 25% of the US ad market, and that number is going down every year. So there's no dominance there. Secondly, what people forget about WhatsApp, when WhatsApp was a freestanding company, it didn't have a lot of users, so you couldn't WhatsApp with a lot of people. Secondly, it cost money. So my daughter, her best friend now lives in Indonesia. They went from kindergarten all the way up. Their parents were Indonesian. They moved back. They were diplomats. My daughter, every Saturday morning for 4 years, communicates a video chat on WhatsApp with her best friend for free. And she's going to be friends with that girl until who knows when. That never would have happened. For free. So before WhatsApp was acquired by Facebook, you had to pay a subscription fee, and it had very few users. Facebook acquired it. They let everybody use it for free. There are now 5 times more users, and I just don't see how anybody says there could be any possible harm from that. Secondly, about acquisitions, there's a great book called Never Lost Again. It's a startup company in California that figured out a way to have rendering of maps so that when you went down, it just automatically rendered. It was an amazing software invention, discovery. And they thought they were going to be able to undersell the main map provider, who was CD-ROM, sold their CDs for $200 a year, subscription fee. They thought they could sell them for $60 a year, and it would take them 15 years to map every single street in the United States. They happened to be located 2 blocks from Google. They went over and had lunch with Sergey Brin one day. Sergey said, I'd like to buy your company. They said, great, we need an exit. Sergey said, fine, let's put $2 billion in right now. And they mapped every single street in the United States in 2 years and provided the service for free. Again, where is the possible consumer harm there? Lastly, I just want to say, when you talk about capitalism today, the big rap on capitalism is too many companies are short-term, they only think about quarterly profits, they don't invest in the future. That is not tech companies. Tech companies, as I said, of the top 20 R&D spenders in the world, 6 of them are US technology companies. They're putting all that money they're the ones who brought us self-driving cars. It wasn't the car companies. Car companies brought self-driving cars after. AI, drones, language to machine. These are the engines of innovation, and if we regulate, we're going to squash that engine.
Very effective, thank you. I believe we now go to Melanie.
The remarks we just heard are very typical and appealing. Where is the harm? Things are for free. How does it get better than this? Well, the reality is that while these platforms are competing for the market, they are competing aggressively. They are taking costs out of the consumer. But what can't be ignored is that that is a relentless march to dominance, and once that dominance is achieved, the only incentive to innovate is to find more ways to exploit that market power. People aren't dumb, of course they're not, and I would never say such a thing. But we are not, as the economists call it, econs. We do not always act rationally in our best interest. In fact, the field of behavioral economics over the last 30 years or so has been growing to recognize that there are incredibly stupid things that people do. We do not act in our best interest. We have a systematic preference for immediate gratification over the value we claim to feel and do feel for other interests, such as our privacy interests, but we are unable to moderate our behavior to protect that interest. What is essential to convey is that today the platform's conduct is not unlawful. It is perfectly rational. In fact, the platform's conduct is demanded by their very fiduciary duties to their shareholders. They must devote every ounce of their innovative energy to coming up with new ways, once entrenched, to further entrench that power and to secure their economic and monopoly rents as best they can in every reach of our lives. The question for you at the end of the day is, are we prepared to sit back, eyes closed, and allow every facet of our life, from our purchasing decisions, to our news feed, to our elections, to our voice, to be manipulated, exploited, and shared for private profit, shared by the very few? Are we prepared for the economic consequences of deterring real innovation? Because make no mistake, once the monopoly power is secured, you will see no innovation that advances consumer interests. Are we prepared to have no competition for our eyeballs and our dollars, for violence to be inspired? Are we prepared to be served only by a very few options and to be slaves to those masters? Or do we step in, as generations have before us, to address the massive opportunity that is presented by this revolutionary innovation, but also that risks hoarding those benefits for the few? Intervention in a market is always a last resort, and it is critical that we approach the necessary trade-offs embedded in any kind of market interference with as much measure and thoughtful approach as we can muster. We want to be surgical. Don't just pass prohibitive laws. Be creative. Establish a framework where expertise and vision can be brought to bear, and where we can adjust and be agile when we necessarily are required to pivot, to respond to change. But act we must, or we will sacrifice our fundamental freedoms and our personal agency. While imperfect, and I'm the first to acknowledge it, as my partner already has, that susceptible to mistakes as our elected officials are, and our law enforcement agencies, they are the only possible guardian of the public interest in this fight. And we must rise to the challenge in our capacity as members of various organizations in our society to support and to help guide the calls for help in designing this critical regulatory response.
Well said, well said, in the logic of these things, it does provide a bit of a segue to David. David.
Well, thank you to fellow panelists for a really great discussion. I've certainly learned a lot tonight. There's the old saying, which I often use with political candidates who got tired of giving their stump speech, that repetition does not spoil the prayer. And so I do want to reinforce something that Robert said as you think about this question you were asked to vote on, should we regulate big tech? That is just too narrow a question. If we think about, yes, are there places for government, whether that's regulation or legislation around data, around algorithms, around content? Maybe, maybe not. But this isn't simply a question about 4 or 5 companies. You've got housing, you've got financing, you've got entertainment. You have so many different companies and parts of our economy that if you just deal with this in a very narrow, inelegant way, I think you're going to do a lot of harm. Content's interesting. There was a review in the UK recently, I think it was called the Cairncross Review, that looked at this very important question about content and the effect that big tech companies are having on publishers. And I think there was a lot of anticipation that that report would come out with sweeping findings, but pretty modest findings. Before I get to that, in the United States, 78% of our population, so that captures a lot of people right, left, center, everywhere in between, believes that when you think about tech companies who are engaged in serving content, that they should be regulated as publishers, who of course are protected constitutionally in our country, the right of free speech. Because I think people understand we have to tread very carefully. So some of the recommendations out of that review in the UK were, if there's going to be a significant change to algorithms that the tech companies utilize, there should be proper notification in terms of time period for the publishers, that there should be a desire to have high quality content produced, and to have maybe a government panel review that from time to time to report on progress. But I think one of the reasons that there was such modest recommendations was they understood the gulf. So Director Comey talked about experts, and there certainly are experts who are available to elected officials and regulators. But there is not a lot of world-class engineering talent or world-class talent in machine learning or in the various disciplines of AI and automation. And the gulf between, I think, what you're seeing in the private sector and what's available to regulators as they fashion responses to some of these questions and challenges is about as wide as between Nigel Lafarge and Jeremy Corbyn. It is just really vast. And again, I think it sounds good, the question of should we regulate big tech? Again, I think we have to broaden that out. But it is more of a soundbite than not, because what really matters is how we do it, when we do it. Are we taking a 15 or 20 or 25-year aperture? From my time running around the world talking to people about something as simple as ride sharing, maybe it was a 6-month or 12-month view, not thinking about how these questions of technology and how these companies are going to affect the way people live. And so I think we have to be really, really careful here about what we do. And again, I think the social media perversely in a way makes this more complicated, because I think politicians and regulators feel the need to respond almost reflexively. And I think one of the challenges I have with some of my fellow progressives is sometimes we feel the need to protect everyone from everything. And that, of course, makes no sense. We have to be thoughtful about it. And my view is, we should only think about regulation when it's the right time, when the right people are in the room, when we've done it in a way that looks beyond the horizon, 15, 20, 25 years, when we're sure we're not going to do. I mean, Melanie, I think, very persuasively talked about competition, and that if we don't regulate, we're going to stifle innovation. These companies, whether it's Amazon, Facebook, Netflix, Google, Uber, Airbnb, financial banks, they are driven each and every day to innovate. Because that's ultimately going to be what their bottom line is.
Thank you. We are continuing to get new insights right down to the wire here. James Comey wraps up. Jim, please.
Great. Thank you very much. Thanks to my fellow debaters and to you all, not just for the debate, but for what it represents and I hope models, especially for my beloved country. We struggle in the United States to have discussion about hard issues without hating. President Obama, in the last year of his second term, devoted a lot of time to one of the aspects we mentioned tonight, which is just a slice of the problem we face, and that is this problem of ubiquitous encryption. How do we balance our love for security, protecting our data, protecting our banking information, protecting our commerce, against our love for security, which is protecting our children, protecting our cities, our infrastructure from attack? How do we do that? And he described it as one of the hardest problems he's ever seen. And I agree with him. It's the hardest problem I saw in government. We're at a place now in the United States where it's impossible to have that conversation. And I know you have all kinds of issues and challenges in your own public life, but you are so much better off with so much less hate in the room when you talk about hard things than we, and I hope very much that we can learn from the example north of the border. So thank you for representing that. There's a lot of agreement up here. We very much agree that big tech has done wonderful things for all of humanity. They have brought us the capability to communicate and to connect, to love each other and know each other across distance and across time. They've brought us the ability to solve hard problems like disease surveillance by aggregating big data and being able to search through it. They've helped us at the FBI figure out how do we take all of these dots we've collected all over the world and make sense of these, find that needle in the haystack. They have done great things for humanity. We can't ever forget that. And when we regulate, we got to keep that front of mind. All four of us agree about that. We also agree that they are good people. And I read in the New York Times about a month ago an article by Mark Zuckerberg's former partner who said, we got to break up Facebook. But Mark Zuckerberg is a good guy, and I agree with that. I agree the people at Twitter are good people. They helped us expel the so-called Islamic State from Twitter. The Islamic State was using Twitter in Canada and the United States to radicalize, to recruit, to direct. And Twitter was wildly overmatched. They had 5 or 6 people whose job it was to try and find these terrorists on their system and kick them off, and they wildly scaled up because it was the right thing to do. So great product, great people. That can't be the end of the analysis, though. There's no doubt that great transformations in technology pose great challenges. Gutenberg, I'm sure, the steam engine, I'm sure, the automobile, I'm sure, and I know, as Rob said, with the advent of technologies in the middle part of the last century, people said the world is going to end, and it didn't end. But this is a transformation that we couldn't have imagined 50 years ago. Artificial intelligence poses the real prospect that machines will outthink us. Not to be all Terminator 1 on you, but that the machines will become self-aware. That is no joke. This notion of synchronicity, right, that where a machine achieves a sense of itself apart from us is an extraordinary development in human existence. We cannot drift into that future. We cannot depend upon good people to make decisions into that future, or good companies. The governments of this world are entrusted with making those judgments on behalf of their citizens, and so we must act. Now, why do we focus on the big ones first? If you have one lifeguard, where do you ask the lifeguard to focus? The deep end of the pool, because that's where the drowning risk is. We must focus on big tech first, because that's where the drowning risk is for our great countries and our citizens. Thank you for your time.
That was great. I think I speak for everyone in the room, so we are very much more deeply in your debt after that exchange. The logic of the debate is clear. We do have to go to a vote. So what I will invite everyone to do is to relocate that clicker. And again, we are going to have votes from everyone in the room and then separated out the jury. The logic of it requires that we vote for or against the resolution as previously. So let me just say while you're doing that, and then I'll stop talking because I'm sure there's some conversation at the tables. If we had another dimension Did we learn? Were we encouraged to take some new evidence into view? Did we learn more nuance about the type of regulation that might be appropriate in these circumstances and what some of the unintended effects might be? I think I speak with confidence for the room in saying that vote will be off the scale. That was tremendous. Thank you. And now, using rather less advanced technology than some of what we've been talking about, we will be taking your votes and compiling the results. Please enjoy exchanging a few views at your tables. I won't monopolize your attention here while you're doing it. We have a result.
We did not go up. We went down slightly.
Look how big they went.
Well,
You guys
how about
killed it.
that? So, ladies and gentlemen, I trust I was speaking for everyone when I said how much we had learned from the discussion. It does appear that there has been something of a shift in opinion. The jury, I think, was more unsure at the beginning and perhaps more persuadable. But as it stands, we do have a predominance of opinion that big tech needs to be regulated in the public interest. But we also have some people who shifted a bit to the skeptical side of that. And so credit to the affirmative team for having made their case so strongly, and to the negative team for having alerted us to some of the nuances, some of the unintended consequences, and the need to get it right. Let me not detain you longer. You've had snacks on the table. You've had an enormous amount to think about, and our debaters have really given us the benefit of their knowledge, their wisdom, their insights, and a certain amount of sparkling repartee as well. So, ladies and gentlemen, we will come to a close. I do want to say thank you to my colleagues, Devin, Paulina, my colleagues on the events team. I'm sorry, I'm dazzled by the lights. I can't see where you are. Could I ask you to stand and be recognized? Great job. Thank you. I want to thank the jury members for their collaboration, all of you for being here. Of course, Aaron and Heather Regent, we really appreciate your ongoing support of this event. And tonight was an absolute standout. One more big round of applause, please, for Melanie, Jim, Rob, and David. Thank you. And one final remark, there was some discussion up here as the vote was happening about the extraordinary privilege, the benefit that we have of being able to come together and debate these things in this kind of a fashion, a civil debate motivated by facts, people who are interested in hearing the logic, hearing the other side. So thank you for that. It's been an outstanding evening. We are done. Good evening.
Great work.
Awesome. Thank you. That's real